A dark blue package with a delivery service logo bumped into Kim's knee with every step as he hurried past a row of expensive cars whose combined cost could cover his rent for the next 20 years. A high-rise building on the embankment. A glass needle with lights around the perimeter was reflected in the wet asphalt after the rain. Kim tried not to stare at these reflections because his figure in the crumpled jacket looked out of place there, even against the background of puddles. Kim checked the address on his phone screen against the brass plaque at the entrance. He needed to get to the private event suite on the 42nd floor. The order arrived via a corporate account, was paid in advance, and the client briefly specified that you should use the service elevator and not linger in the lobby. Kim took this as a polite request to remain inconspicuous. The security guard at the counter looked Kim up and down, his eyes lingering on the loose-soled sneakers, and pointed to a side door. The service elevator smelled of engine oil and forgotten coffee. Kim leaned against the wall, holding the bag to his side, and looked up at the flickering ceiling light. Part-time delivery work covered about a third of his monthly expenses, and he had long since stopped thinking about where and to whom exactly he was taking other people's orders. On the 42nd floor, Kim was greeted by a wall of sound before the elevator doors opened completely. The music came from behind the sliding glass panels at the end of the corridor, not loud, but insistent, like the air pressure before a thunderstorm. Kim walked across the geometric carpet, past several waiters in white jackets, found the side door marked by the coordinator on the diagram, and knocked. No one opened the door marked coordinator. Kim knocked again, harder. The door moved of its own accord. It was closed, but not locked. He entered a small technical corridor that overlooked the side of the huge hall. At that moment, Kim made a mistake. He was looking at the phone, trying to find the number of the receiver, and did not notice that a man turned sharply 2 steps away from him. The impact was light, more like a touch, but the bag flew out of Kim's hands, and a dozen small lunch boxes with individual packaging scattered on the lacquered floor at the feet of a group of people in evening clothes. The sound was unpleasant, and the silence that followed was even more so. Kim looked up. The person he hit was a man, about Kim's age, in a light gray suit with an H-shaped pin on the lapel. Her hair was neatly combed back, suggesting expensive care products. He held a glass of amber liquid in his hand and stared at the scattered boxes as if a street pigeon had just stepped on his shoe. Behind him was a group of 3 people, 2 men and 1 woman, who looked at Kim with the same detached curiosity as a fly that had accidentally flown into the office. Kim bent down and began to collect the boxes. He did it methodically, without fuss, knowing that an extra fuss would only attract attention, and he didn't need it right now. He picked up 3 boxes and reached for the 4th. The toe of a patent leather boot landed squarely on top of her. Kim looked up the length of the gray suit. The man with the pin looked down at him with his usual calm, slightly lazy expression, which did not express anger, but rather confidence in the comfort of his own position. The man spoke, more to his group than to Kim. He said that the staff had obviously stopped reading the instructions, because this delivery entrance had been closed since 6 in the evening, and if someone didn't understand what was written, they shouldn't expect a tip. The 3 men behind him laughed briefly, not maliciously, but casually, which was even worse. Kim took his hand away from the box under his shoe and straightened up. He was about the same height as the man in the suit, maybe an inch shorter. The waiters were standing nearby, looking straight ahead. The music in the glass-paneled room continued to play. No one was going to interfere. Everyone present had a well-developed instinct for invisibility in situations where visibility could be costly. Kim stared at the man for a few seconds, then calmly explained that the supply entrance was located here, and that was exactly what his app said. If something changed in the instructions of the private party after placing the order, then this is not a question for him, but for the person who issued it. Then he bent down, picked up the box that the man had stepped on, gently but surely pulled it towards him, and put it in the bag. The silence lasted longer than it should have. The man in the suit narrowed his eyes slightly. Kim noticed this small gesture because he could read such small details, a skill he developed in situations where large gestures are expensive. Kim took the bag, straightened up, and calmly asked who was taking the order. A female member of the group quietly replied that the host is Choi Juno, who is inside. Kim nodded, took a step to the side, walked around the man in the gray suit, and into the hall. Behind the glass panels, it was spacious and cold in the peculiar way that expensive air conditioners and people who are not used to showing emotions in public spaces create. There were about 30 people in the hall. The clothes were without a single random element. High tables lined the glass wall that overlooked the waterfront, and the lights of the city behind the glass looked like a specially selected decoration for the evening. Kim found Choi Juno at the far end of the bar, handed over the package, waited for the signature on the app, and turned to leave. At that moment, a loud voice came from from behind, deliberately loud so that at least half of the audience could hear it. The voice belonged to a man in a light gray suit who had already entered the room and was standing at a table 2 meters away from the nearest group of guests. He was telling someone nearby that delivery services now seemed to be recruiting people without basic spatial orientation skills, and that this explains a lot, including the level of service in the city as a whole. Several people turned around and some smiled. Kim stopped walking. He stood with his back to the room for a moment, then turned around. The man in the suit was looking directly at him with a slight, almost benevolent smile that meant he was absolutely certain there would be no answer. Kim walked slowly back through the hall, stopped 2 steps away from the group at the table and calmly, without raising his voice, clarified that the order was delivered on time. The entrance was used according to the scheme received from the platform, and if the host party has complaints about logistics, they can issue them through the application with a 1-star rating. This will affect its rating by about 0.03%. Then he added that the clothes on the man in the suit were good, but the lapel pin was worth about the same as his hourly rate. He knows this because he saw the exact same one in the window 3 days ago and kept it as an example of a reasonable overpayment for the logo. The room grew quieter. It wasn't quite quiet. The music was still playing, but a few conversations were clearly interrupted. The man in the suit kept his smile on, but it took a little more effort now, as you could tell by the subtle tension along his jaw. Kim nodded to the group as a whole, briefly and neutrally, then turned and headed for the exit. This time, no one stopped him. In the elevator, he exhaled and leaned against the wall. The fingers gripping the handle of the empty bag were tighter than he wanted to admit. Kim pressed the button for the first floor and stared at the flashing overhead light. It was cooler outside. The rain had stopped, but the asphalt still glistened, and the city looked a little better in puddles than in reality. Kim walked around the corner of the building, found a bench by the parked bicycles, and sat down not out of fatigue, but to be completely quiet for about 2 minutes before turning on the GPS again and taking the next order. He took his next order in 4 minutes. The restaurant is 12 blocks away. Nothing remarkable. He was almost up when a car pulled up beside him. It wasn't a random car that had stopped at the curb, but a black sedan with tinted windows that had deliberately braked at arm's length from Kim. A second later, the rear window came down about halfway. Kim didn't move. He looked directly at the window and waited. They studied him from the darkness of the car. The pause was long enough to be deliberate. Then a woman's hand appeared in the doorway with a thin silver ring on her index finger. She was holding a small white card with no text. The woman with the silver ring held out the card horizontally in Kim's direction with 2 fingers, clearly indicating that she was offering to take it. Kim stared at the card for a few seconds, then got up, walked over to the car, and picked it up. There was only a phone number on the back of the card. The car's window rolled up. The car moved smoothly and noiselessly, and 20 seconds later it disappeared around the bend. Kim was left standing at the curb with a white card in his hand. He turned it over several times, as if expecting to see something else, then put it back in the breast pocket of his jacket, picked up the empty bag from the ground, and opened the app again. The order was still waiting 12 blocks away, and Kim went. For the next hour, as he drove between addresses and up other people's driveways, his hand sometimes touched his breast pocket by itself unconsciously to make sure that the card was still there. That night, lying on the narrow bed in the room he shared with 3 other tenants, Kim stared at the ceiling for a long time. The neighbors were asleep, and early traffic was noisy outside the window. He took out a card and placed it on his chest, face up, with the number pointing at the ceiling. He didn't know who was in that car, but in the hall, as he turned and walked toward the exit, he caught a glimpse of one face motionless, standing a little apart from the main group against the glass wall overlooking the embankment. It was a woman who wasn't looking at the man in the suit or Kim, but was looking somewhere between them, at a point only she could see. Her dark hair was pulled back in one motion, and her gaze was flat and horizontal, like a horizon that doesn't react to clouds. Kim didn't know her name, but he didn't throw the card away. In the morning, he woke up before the alarm. The crack above the right corner of the ceiling was visible, and the card was lying on the windowsill. He picked it up, looked at the number, and dialed. After one ring, there was a silence that felt like a presence. The woman's voice didn't answer immediately, but it was low and even, without any inflection, as if she already knew he was going to call, and the call was neither a surprise nor a special event. The voice said that she had a suggestion that might interest him. This was not a question, but a statement formulated as fact. Kim asked who she was. A female voice replied that he would know if he agreed. Kim said he wanted to hear the offer first. After a brief pause, the voice explained that she needed someone to impersonate her companion at several public events over the next month. The terms included full coverage for the duration of the contract, a fixed amount at the end of the contract, and the only requirement was to behave naturally and not ask unnecessary unnecessary questions in public. The amount was named. Kim closed his eyes, realizing that this was the money he was earning from 9 months of shipping. He opened his eyes and asked why exactly he was here. The answer came without pause. She'd seen him talk to Han Jae-won in the audience, and a person who could talk to Han Jae-won the way he talked without fear or aggression suited her. The man in the light gray pinned suit now had a name, Han Jae-won. Kim sat up in bed and put his feet on the cold floor. He hadn't said yes yet, but he wasn't thinking about the next order in the app. Outside the window, dawn was beginning to break, gray and blurry, just meaning that the night was over. Kim looked at the card in his hand and thought that under normal circumstances, a reasonable person would put it back on the windowsill, drink tea, and forget. But his circumstances weren't normal for a long time. He grew up in a city 3 hours from the capital, in an area where the names of people he knew often matched the names of businesses that had closed down 15 years ago. His mother worked in a pharmacy, his father worked on a construction site, and the family was confident enough to pay for his first year of university. He closed the second year with a self-grant, which required him to write 12 applications. It was now his third year, and between couples, he took other people's food to addresses that sometimes cost more than his annual rent. He looked at the number on the card again. The voice on the phone waited, not impatiently, but smoothly and without pressure, like a man unaccustomed to being ignored. Kim asked if he had time to think before the next morning. The voice said, "I'd see you tonight." Kim put the phone away, got up, went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water from the tap, and drank it while standing, looking out the small window over the sink to a courtyard with trash cans and an abandoned bicycle without a rear wheel. At the university, he had a lecture at 9, then a seminar before noon, and then 3 hours of delivery if he wanted to close the month without paying rent. He put on his jacket, picked up his backpack, and left. The morning transport was full of people with equally blank faces. Kim stood at the railing and looked out of the window, but he didn't see the street. He saw the hall on the 42nd floor, the glass wall, the lights of the embankment beyond it, and the woman on the wall with a horizontal gaze, who looked at a point between two people and didn't react to either of them. The lecture passed him by. His head kept spinning. A person with her level of resources could find a candidate through any closed channel. Why did she pull up to the bike park bench with a white card? Because she'd seen him in the audience. So what she needed was not just someone in a good suit, but someone who could stand up straight in an awkward situation without losing his bearings. During recess, he typed Han Jae-won's name into the search engine. The results were enough. The heir of the Han Capital Group, 24 years old. On one occasion, he met a woman in a gossip column whose name Kim found in the next result, Seoul. She was the sole heir to the Seoul Group, a holding company with assets in the pharmaceutical, commercial real estate, and media sectors. She was 22 years old. There weren't many publicly available photos. She was always slightly out of the center of the frame, with a neutral expression on her face, and none of them looked directly at the camera. Kim closed the phone and reread the amount she had mentioned, memorizing it correctly. The 3 hours of delivery after the workshop were mechanical. In between, he went to a small cafe, got a half-price tea, and sat down by the window. He took out a card, placed it on the table in front of him, and stared at it until he finished his drink. He called at 1640. She answered on the first ring. Kim said he agreed, but wanted a face-to-face meeting before signing any document. There was a brief pause. Then a voice said that the meeting would be tomorrow and the address would come at 9 in the morning. The connection was interrupted. Kim stood on the sidewalk, opened the app, and took the next order. He went to bed earlier than usual that night. The card was lying on the windowsill. "I got the address this morning." The coffee shop in the business district was on the first floor of a dark glass and polished concrete building. It was quiet, and the tables were spaced well apart, each with a small live branch in a narrow vase. Kim came in at 10 sharp. She was sitting by a window at the back of the hall, her back to the wall and her face to the door. He recognized her immediately, not from the search photos, but from the stillness he'd noticed in the room on the 42nd floor. Both of her hands were on the table, fingers slightly intertwined, and there was a cup in front of her that she didn't seem to have touched since she sat down. Kim walked across the room, set his backpack down by the leg of the chair across from him, and sat down. Seoul looked at him steadily, not trying to create a comfortable distance. Her dark eyes were almost devoid of light, the kind that made it hard to guess the direction of her thoughts. Her hair was pulled low, a few strands falling down her face. He wore a simple dark blue coat and a silver ring on the index finger of his left hand, the same one that had held the card by the car window. She didn't say hello first, just waited. Kim put his hands on the table and calmly said that he was here and ready to listen to an explanation. She began to speak softly, like someone who wasn't used to repeating herself. Her family pressed her about her engagement to Han Jae-won. The combination of the two funds gave them combined control over assets sufficient to restructure several industry markets. It was was a logical move for both families, but not for her. She needed time and a visible reason why negotiations could be suspended without a direct conflict. The public partner provided just that, space and an argument expressed not in words, but in fact. Kim listened. When she stopped talking, he asked her why it was him and not someone she trusted. Her answer was short. Those she trusts are inside the same system and are vulnerable to pressure. She needs someone outside who doesn't have anything that the family can use against him, and who knows how to talk to Han Jae-won face-to-face without looking away. Kim looked down at his hands on the table, then at her. He said he accepts, but wants a written contract with clear exit conditions for both sides. She took the folded sheets from the inside pocket of her coat and placed them on the table in front of him. The document was already ready, and she clearly didn't doubt his answer. Kim took the papers, unfolded them, and began to read. The woman in the gray jacket didn't rush him, just took the first sip from her cup. Kim flipped to the last page, looked up, and picked up the pen that she had placed next to the document before he could ask. The cold air of the underground parking lot smelled of gasoline and money. Kylie stood at the service elevator of the high-end Sangwon Tower, clutching a thermos bag with delivery, and looked at the phone screen. The deadline was 8 minutes away. The staff elevator was shut down for the third time in a week, and the metal doors were frozen with a half-open gap that smelled of burnt wiring. Kai didn't wait. He turned to the fire escape, pushed the heavy door open with his shoulder, and started up floor after floor. The stairs echoed under his sneakers, and his thermos bag pressed against his shoulder. On the 23rd floor, he didn't think about the elevator or the fatigue. Only about 8 minutes and a fine of 1/3 of the day's earnings. He stepped out into the glass corridor, adjusted the strap of his bag, and headed for the reception area. The receptionist in the white jacket didn't even look up from the monitor, just reached for the bag as if he was going to drop it in a drawer and forget it. Kai left the bag, turned around, and was just about to leave when a short, sharp laugh, like the sound of broken glass, rang out behind him. 3 men in expensive suits were standing by the picture window, holding glasses. One of them, a tall man with slickback hair, looked directly at Kai and spoke softly to the others, not hiding a smile. Kai couldn't hear the words, but the direction of his gaze and the tilt of his head said enough. He didn't look away, just stared back calmly for exactly 2 seconds, then turned and walked toward the stairs. This was not a sign of weakness, but the decision of a man who still had 3 deliveries left before the end of the shift and did not have time for other people's games. Outside, a November wind greeted him. Kai put on his helmet, started the bike, and pulled out of the parking lot onto a wide avenue of evening lights. Seoul glowed from top to bottom, from skyscrapers to sidewalk food stalls, and somewhere between those 2 worlds, he drove every day without belonging to either of them. The next address was in Itaewon, a restaurant on the 3rd level of the mall. Kai got there in 7 minutes, handed in his order, got approved in the app, and was turning to leave when a woman in a black coat almost bumped into him. She was walking fast, not looking ahead, and the phone was pressed to her ear. Kai stepped to the right, and she walked past him without looking back. All he could see was her shoulder-length dark hair, her straight back, and the way her fingers gripped the phone, not out of anger, but something else that was harder to name. Kai didn't dwell on it for more than a second. He got on his motorcycle and drove on. That night, at home, in a 1-room apartment on the outskirts of Mapo with a chimney that hummed with every gust of wind, Kai sat down at his laptop, opened the expense chart, and began to calculate the balance of the week. The numbers didn't add up. Rent increased by 4%. 3 orders were canceled at the last minute without compensation, and the motorcycle repair after last week took almost everything that he had postponed for a month. He closed the chart, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and went to bed, not because he'd given up, but because his shift started at 6 tomorrow morning. 2 days later, Kai was summoned to a meeting, not through the app or the dispatcher, but from an unknown number. I received a short message with the address and time. Kai reread it 3 times, decided that it was either a mistake or another advertisement, and was about to delete it when the second message arrived with his first name, and last delivery route to Sangwon Tower. He's arrived. The address led him to a private business center on Gyeongno, a meeting room with frosted glass and a low ceiling. Waiting for him was a woman in her mid-40s in a gray jacket, a folder on her lap, and the look of someone who can count the time of someone's conversation more accurately than her own. She introduced herself as the Shin family's special affairs secretary and told him without preamble that her employer wanted to offer Kai a contract. Kai sat across from her, hands on his knees, listening. He was asked to play the role of the companion of the Shin family's only daughter, Shin Ai, for a period of 3 months. The duties included public appearances, corporate events, several formal dinners, and 1 major end-of-term fundraiser. In return, he received an amount equal to his earnings for 8 months of delivery, plus coverage of all related costs. No personal relationships, no contact outside of the script, complete confidentiality. Kai asked why he had been chosen. The woman opened the folder and placed a printed page in front of him with his details, directions, and the date of the evening at Songwon Tower. It turned out that on that day, when he stood in the glass corridor and looked into the eyes of a man with a glass, he was captured by an internal camera. Shin AI was looking through the records from that floor for a different reason and accidentally saw this moment. According to the secretary, she was interested in how Kai did not look away and left on his own, and not in appearance or biography. Kai was silent for a long time after this explanation. Then he said he wanted to think about it until morning. The woman nodded, handed him the card, and stood up. Before leaving, she paused at the door and added that Shin AI wasn't looking for a company, wasn't looking for an actor, and wasn't looking for someone to manage. She's looking for someone who won't break under pressure. Then she closed the door. Kai left the building, got on his motorcycle, and didn't start the engine for a long time. The avenue ahead of him was bustling with taxis, buses, and the neon signs of coffee shops that he drove around 3 times a day. He wasn't thinking about the money, even though the money was real and needed. He thought about that line, about how someone had watched the tape and stopped it just as he was leaving. He knew that he was being watched, that he had already been evaluated, and that the decision he made in the morning would have consequences in every direction. He started the bike and drove home. In the morning, Kai wrote one word in response to the secretary's number: I agree. The meeting was scheduled for the next evening at a private club in Gangnam, closed to outsiders, with security at the entrance and an underground parking lot without a sign. Kai arrived on his motorcycle, parked among the black sedans, took off his helmet, and walked past the security guard, who was looking at him with that special expression that says everything without words. Inside, he was led down a short, softly lit corridor and stopped in front of a door at the end. The room behind the door was small: a sofa, a coffee table, 2 armchairs by the window with dark curtains. One of the chairs was occupied by a woman, the one in black with dark hair who had walked past him in Itaewon without looking back. Kai stopped in the doorway. The woman slowly looked up from her phone, not surprised, like someone who knows who's coming in beforehand. Her face was regular and closed at the same time. High cheekbones, dark eyes with a look that wasn't asking, but stating. She didn't smile, just tilted her head slightly to take the second chair. Kai went in, closed the door, and sat down. For a few seconds, they just stared at each other, no hostility, but no warmth. Then the woman put the phone on the armrest and said that she had already read his brief file, and she did not need either a biography or motivation. All she needed to understand was how he behaved under public pressure. She said it flatly, as if it were a technical requirement, not a personal question. Kai replied briefly that he doesn't respond to pressure where the reaction works against him. The woman narrowed her eyes slightly, not skeptically, but rather registering his words. Then she picked up a thin folder from the table, handed it to him, and informed him that the first public appearance would take place in 10 days, a corporate dinner of the Shin family with partners from Hong Kong. There will be people who have known her since childhood and will immediately try to test Kai for strength as soon as they realize that he is new. Kai opened the folder. Inside was a guest list, seating chart, brief biographies of 8 key people, and 3 lines under the heading, What Not to Say. He read it slowly, then closed the folder and looked at the woman. He asked why the list was so detailed. Shin AI replied that he would be next to her, not behind her. This meant that anyone who wanted to hit it through it would hit it first. She wanted him to know that before he entered the hall. The room fell silent. Kai stared at her, at the straight line of her shoulders, the immobile fingers resting on the armrest without any nervousness or petty play that betrayed alarm. She wasn't playing the role of confident. She just was, or had learned to be, which was probably the same thing in her world. Kai said that he understood and added one condition. If he had to make his own decision right in the hall, without consulting her, he would do it. Not because he wants to go beyond the contract, but because at the moment when something goes wrong, procrastination is more expensive than breaking the protocol. Shin AI stared at Kai for a little longer than usual, then gave a curt nod without words. This was not an endorsement, but rather an acceptance of the condition, as one accepts a non-standard clause in a business agreement without enthusiasm, but also without objection. The meeting ended quickly. Shin AI got up first, picked up her phone and coat, told her that the details would be sent in tomorrow morning, and left without looking back. Kai sat there for a few more seconds, staring at the closed door. He had a secretary's card in his pocket and a folder on his desk with the names of people who would be watching him in 10 days' time, waiting for him to make a mistake. Kai picked up the folder, got up, and went out into the hallway. It was a cold November outside. Kai put on his helmet, started the bike, and drove out onto the avenue. The windows of Gangnam's boutiques were already closed, and the mannequins were illuminated from the inside. He ignored them, thinking of the 8 people on the list, each of whom wasn't used to someone lower in status looking them in the eye without embarrassment. At home, Kai opened his laptop, but not the expense chart, but a browser with the Shin family's corporate archives. He read for a long time, made notes on his phone, and fell asleep only in the early morning. The next morning, Kai received a text message with the address of a private atelier in an alley behind the Apgujeong shopping district, 3rd floor, without a sign. The master, a man in his late 60s with glasses on the tip of his nose, met him without ceremony, led him to the podium in front of the mirror, and silently began to measure him, using the usual movements of a person for whom the body is a set of coordinates. Kai stood up straight and stared into the mirror, where the space behind him was reflected: light walls, racks of fabrics, a glass cabinet with finished products. As he was leaving, Kai noticed Shin AI's reflection in the corner of the mirror, standing at the entrance to the next room with a cup of coffee and watching the process, as if checking not the suit, but his behavior when he does not know that people are looking at him. Their eyes met in the mirror, and she didn't look away. Kai didn't look away either. Then she turned and left, the door closing softly behind her. In the following days, Kai had 3 meetings with the secretary: dry, businesslike, and strictly businesslike. The secretary explained how to behave at events, what topics to avoid with specific people, and how to respond to provocative questions about the origin, which are sure to happen. Kai listened, memorized, and asked no questions. The only thing he asked was about the boundary between his behavior as Shin AI's partner and himself. The secretary replied that there is no such limit. He should be himself. That's what they expect. 3 days before the dinner, 2 people were added to the guest list: Jang Hyunjun, the chief executive of a rival holding company, and his son Jang Minsu, with whom Shin AI had a history that did not require comment. Kai read the note twice, flipped the page, and began to study the biography of Jang Hyunjun, a man who could ask questions that even experienced negotiators would lose track of. That same evening, Kai took out an old common notebook, opened a blank page, wrote Jang Hyunjun on the top, and began to build a diagram: what he will say first, what he will count on, where there will be a pause that can be used as leverage. It was preparation, not fear. On the day of dinner, a car was sent for Kai, a dark sedan with a black-clad driver who didn't say a word. Kai sat in the back seat, put his notebook in his pocket, and stared out the window as the city drifted by. Nighttime Seoul from the window of such a car created a sense of distance, as if you were looking from a height and not from inside. Kai noticed the sensation and put it aside. The car stopped at the hotel entrance. The doorman opened the door. Kai stepped out, adjusted his cuffs, and headed for the light. Shin AI was waiting for him in the lobby. She was standing by a tall pillar in a deep night dress with a thin silver shoulder, her hair pulled back at the base of her neck, and her earrings were small, dark, and without glitter. No flashy decorations about money, just a well-adjusted general line. She looked at Kai without evaluation, only registering his presence. He came, looked right, the contract started. Kai walked over and stood at the right distance, not too close, not too far. Shin AI quietly informed her that if someone pushed her, she would switch the conversation, but if Kai decided to answer for himself, let him do it on his own. This was not support, but consent to its autonomy. The doors to the hall opened. The light was warm and dense, and the guests were already standing in small groups, and the first eyes turned immediately to them, those who know how to notice the entrance before the others. Jang Minsu was the first to approach, with a slight smile of someone who was used to having space as his default. He greeted Shin AI as if Kai didn't exist, then turned his head to look at Shin AI and asked him where he was from with an accentuated politeness. Kai met his gaze without moving and named the neighborhood where he grew up, without the apologies, pauses, or instinctive self-contraction that the tone of the question implied. Just a fact. Jang Minsu narrowed his eyes slightly. Shin AI was standing next to him, and Kai noticed from the corner of his eye that she didn't stiffen. It was the first small but real signal. Sitting across the table from them was Lee Bonsu, an investment fund director and partner of the Shin family for 12 years. He looked at Kai with neutral interest and immediately asked about his occupation. Kai replied that he was engaged in logistics. Lee Bonsu put down his glass with the air of someone accepting an uninteresting answer. Nearby, a woman with diamond earrings exchanged a glance with a neighbor. Shin AI explained without pause to the entire table that Kai was working in exactly the direction that was currently most promising in terms of scaling: the last mile, autonomous routes, and system response speed. She reformatted the context accurately, and without further ado, Lee Bonsu looked at Kai differently. Kai picked up the conversation, explaining where time is lost on standard city routes and why major operators can't fix it from the inside. He wasn't talking theory, but what he knew from practice, from the saddle of a motorcycle. Lee Bonsu asked a clarifying question, and the conversation became real. Towards the middle of the evening, Jang Hyunjun came to the table. Tall, with an even stance and hands behind his back, he stopped at the edge of the table with the precision of an experienced player choosing a position. He greeted Shin AI and turned to Kai, expressing his joy at meeting the person AI had chosen. There was a hidden stab in that phrase, not with whom she came, but with whom she chose, as one chooses a thing. Kai calmly replied that it was the same, and noted that it is always interesting to meet a person whose name appears in every second business archive of the last decade. It sounded like respect, but it meant that someone who knew the archives knew more than just success. Jang Hyunjun slowed down a bit, then smiled for real, said that Kai was an interesting person, turned around and left. Shin AI didn't say anything, but when she reached for her glass, her hand passed within inches of his, a little closer than the usual gesture required, probably by accident. The evening ended after 11. Shin AI approached Kai at the exit when the hall was almost empty. The waiters were clearing away the dishes and putting out parts of the chandeliers. She stopped beside him and was silent for a few seconds, looking at the rows of empty tables. Then she said he'd done better than she'd expected. It wasn't a compliment, but a statement of fact. She added that in 3 weeks it will be more difficult. Kai asked how much. Shin AI turned, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't soft or warm, but alive. That wasn't part of the contract. She said it was enough for him to start preparing now. Then she picked up her coat and headed for the door without looking back. Kai followed her out into the cold November air and found himself thinking that he had expected this evening to be a test of strength. It turned out to be only the first of many. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the balance sheet or the next shift, but about the next night, how it would be harder there, and how it felt real for the first time in a long time. The car arrived at 7 in the morning. It wasn't the same car that had taken him to dinner, but a longer one with tinted windows and a driver who opened the door without saying a word. There was an envelope with his name on it in the back seat. Inside was a printed schedule for the next 2 weeks, an access card to the apartments of the Sangwon residents, and one handwritten line: temporary accommodation for the duration of the contract. Personal items can be collected later. Kai read the line twice, then put the envelope back in his pocket, looked out the window at the waking city, and decided not to ask if this was part of the contract from the beginning or a new condition added without warning. He realized that such things were not discussed out loud here. They were either accepted or not. He accepted. Sangwon residence was located in a quiet neighborhood between 2 wide avenues. Its facade was made of dark glass, dense bushes grew around it, and a barrier guarded the entrance. The car pulled into an underground parking lot, and the driver escorted Kai to the elevator and disappeared. Kai went up to the 18th floor, put the card to the lock, and entered the apartment. The apartment was spacious, dark gray, and cold, not with the temperature, but with the sense of uninhabited space characteristic of catalog-furnished rooms. High ceilings, a full-length panoramic window with a view of the avenue below. The interior was decorated with an anthracite sofa and a glass-top coffee table with only a decanter of water. Not a single personal item, not a single random item. Kai set his bag down at the entrance and went to the window. Down below, Seoul was moving as usual: traffic jams, motorcycles, food stalls. From above, everything looked like a moving diagram, not like life. He stood there for a few seconds, then turned and began to look around the apartment, not out of curiosity, but out of habit of knowing the space he was going to be in. There were already a few things hanging in the closet. They were not his, but someone else's, new and labeled. There were 2 jackets, 3 shirts, and trousers, all in his size. Kai took one jacket off the rack, looked at the label, and hung it back up. He went to the hall mirror and stared at himself for a long time, wearing his jacket and carrying his bag. Then he picked up the phone and texted his secretary, asking who was responsible for the clothes in the closet and what exactly he should be grateful for. The answer came in 3 minutes. This is a standard part of training, approved personally by Shin AI. No additional explanations are provided. Kai put his phone away and started unpacking his bag. By noon, the receptionist called to say that they would be making their first semi-private appearance together at 4 o'clock that afternoon, a business lunch at Miru Restaurant in Chongno. The group will be small, consisting of 7 people, 3 of whom regularly appear in the media space. The event will be informal, but with the presence of cameras. That is why the first time will be held there, and not at a major event. Kai should arrive 20 minutes earlier than Shin AI. Kai asked why he had to come earlier. The receptionist explained that he should already be standing when Shin AI came in, so that everyone could see that he was waiting there. This is the difference between a man who was brought in and a man who came by himself. Kai understood and wrote down the time, ended the call, and opened his laptop. It was still 3 hours to 4. He spent that time studying public information about 3 media people present. One of them wrote a business column for a major online publication. The second was a managing partner of a PR agency. And the third was a woman in her late 40s who was involved in corporate corporate communications and was known for asking questions that sounded like interest but worked like an exam. She was the one that caused Kai the most concern. At 3:30, Kai put on one of the shirts from the closet, not out of desire, but out of an understanding that here every visual choice is taken as a signal. He took a taxi. As long as he didn't have a car, a taxi was better than nothing, but worse than anything else. He noted this as a task for the future. Miru Restaurant occupied the first and second floors of an old building with brick walls and an open, beam ceiling, dark wood, diffused light, the smell of roasted coffee and spices from the kitchen. Kai gave his name at the entrance and was shown up to the second floor to a separate room with a long table by the window that looked out on the courtyard. 3 of the 7 were already seated. They looked at him politely, scrutinizingly, without a gesture of greeting. Kai walked over to the table, identified himself, and sat down so that he could see both the entrance and most of the room. One of the men, the one with the business column, asked him what he did. Kai said that he works in logistics, adding that changes have been taking place in this area over the past 3 years, which large capital is not yet seriously thinking about, but will soon be forced to. The man raised an eyebrow slightly, didn't argue, but caught on. Shin Ai walked in at exactly 20 minutes past 4, not a second earlier or later. She was wearing a light coat with a minimal bag, and her hair was loose. It was a different image from the one at the official dinner, easier visually, but no less controlled in essence. She walked over to the table, greeted each of them in turn, then stopped next to Kai and put her hand on the back of his chair, not on his shoulder, but on the back, just for a second. Then she took her hand away and sat up. The gesture was small, precise, and designed for someone who could read such things. It meant that this man was her choice, not an accident. At the table, the conversation quickly picked up pace. The communications woman, Park Ji-yeon, asked Kai a question about 20 minutes later. She asked him how long he had been around Shin Ai and why he hadn't been seen before. The question sounded friendly, but it was essentially a request for a cover story, a test of how well it could withstand pressure in an informal setting. Kai calmly replied that there was no need for both of them to appear together in public before. He added that some things start not with an event, but with a decision, and this decision was made recently. The pause before the word decision was deliberate, just long enough to create a sense of something personal without saying anything specific. Park Ji-yeon smiled sincerely, noting that it was interestingly worded. Kai nodded and turned his attention to the man on the right, closing the subject without a trace of harshness. Shin Ai sat across the table from me. Kai wasn't looking at her, but in his peripheral vision, he could see that she was taking a sip from her glass just as he finished answering Park Ji-yeon. It might not mean anything. After lunch, as the group began to disperse, Park Ji-yeon paused at the exit and told Kai in a low voice, not threatening, almost like advice that legends were tested more than once in this circle. She said it without malice, just like someone who knew the rules better than he did. Kai thanked her sincerely. Park Ji-yeon narrowed her eyes slightly, as if she wasn't expecting such a reaction, and left. Kai and Shin Ai were left alone at the entrance of the restaurant. The streetlights were already on, the light reflecting off the wet pavement after the day's rain. Shin Ai looked at the avenue and said without turning around that Park Ji-yeon had spoken to him on the way out. It wasn't a question. Kai confirmed that Park Ji-yeon had warned her about the repeated checks. Shin Ai nodded slowly and added in a low voice that Park Ji-yeon does this to every new person in her environment. It's her way of separating those who get lost in the warnings from those who learn from them. Kai asked her what category she put him in so far. Shin Ai turned to him. Her face looked different in the street lamps than it did in the warm light of the restaurant. A little sharper in its lines, a little more open in its eyes. She said it was too early to tell. It was an honest answer, not cold, but honest. The next morning, there was another envelope in the elevator mailbox with an expanded list of events, 2 formal dinners, a corporate photo shoot for a business magazine, and a short interview for a Shin family charity project. The last paragraph was underlined by hand, in the same handwriting as the first handwritten line, with a note to prepare separately. Kai went up to his room, laid down on the couch without undressing, and stared at the ceiling. The interview was a different story. It wasn't a private room or a protocol of polite questions from business partners. It was a public record that would remain. There, every word could be taken out of context, and that is why it was necessary not to say less, but to speak more precisely. He spent the next 2 days in the apartment, reading, taking notes, reviewing past interviews with the Shin family representatives, how they build answers, where they slow down, where they speed up. Once, he was visited by a bespectacled assistant secretary who looked at Kai with restrained curiosity, as if it were an unusual task. The assistant secretary left a folder with additional materials and left without further ado. On the 3rd day, Shin Ai herself called. Her voice was as flat as it had been in person. She said that the photo shoot was postponed and the interview remains as planned. Then she paused briefly, which Kai noticed, and added that if he had any questions about training, she could answer them tonight. Kai asked if it was in person or through his secretary. Shin AI replied that it was in person and named a coffee shop in Seongsa district, near the art spaces of former factories. She hung up before Kai could answer. Kai put the phone down on the table and stared at it for a few seconds. Seonsu wasn't her territory, not Gangnam, not Gyeongno, not corporate high-rises. Either Shin AI wanted to meet where she wasn't expected, or she chose a place where neither of them had the advantage of space. Both options said the same thing. Shin AI was beginning to see Kai as more than just a hired role. The coffee shop in Seongsu was an old brick building with tall windows and uneven dartboard floors. There were several tables inside, the lights were dimmed, and the music was soft. The atmosphere was simple, without glamour. Shin AI was sitting in the corner by the window with a cup of hot drink, wearing a dark sweater, her hair loose, no coat or accessories. It was the first time Kai had ever seen her without the outer layers she usually wore in official places. Shin AI didn't get up when Kai approached, but simply nodded at the chair opposite. Kai sat down, ordered coffee, and immediately asked why the interview required separate preparation. Shin AI curled her fingers around the cup and stared at the table for a few seconds, then replied that the journalist who would be conducting the interview had written an embarrassing piece about her family a few years ago. My father doesn't like this journalist since then. The journalist knows about this and will try to get something from Kai that can be used as an indirect source. This is not out of desire for a scandal, but because it is his job. Kai asked why the Shin family had agreed to interview him. Shin AI chuckled. The corner of her mouth twitched in an ironic smile, and explained that it was her, not her father, who agreed. She has her own reasons for giving this material right now and to this particular person. Kai is not a shield in this situation. On the contrary, he should make the interview honest and not corporate packaging. This was the first reason, which she explained not as an instruction, but as motivation. They spent about an hour together. The conversation moved smoothly from working to live. Kai noticed that Shin AI has a habit of tapping her finger on the table when she's thinking through a sentence, and that she prefers tea over coffee to keep her concentration steady without breaking out. Shin AI asked why Kai hadn't moved closer to the routes in 3 years, even though he could have. Kai replied that he was used to the place. The trumpet was humming, but it was an honest sound. Shin AI looked at him not as an unusual detail, but as a person. It was late in the evening when they came out. The street in Seongsu was quiet, the neon signs of bars and the smell of food from the nearby alley creating an atmosphere. Shin AI stopped on the sidewalk and turned up the collar of her sweater against the wind. Her car was parked 20 meters away. She briefly informed Kai that he was ready for an interview, not by asking, but by stating a fact. Then she added that in an interview, he should speak like a person who has nothing to hide, because it's true. This is what will work better than any legend. Kai stared at her straight posture, the dark sweater, the way she held the collar with her hand until the wind forced her to let go. There was something different about this image than anything he had seen before. Not a weakness, but rather a glimmer of light. At that moment, Shin AI's phone vibrated. She read the message, put the phone away, and said the details would be sent in tomorrow morning. Then she turned and walked back to the car. The interview was scheduled for Friday. Journalist Kwon Chul's studio was located in a small office above a bookstore in Gyeongno. The room had bookshelves to the ceiling, one sofa, 2 chairs, and a camera on a tripod against the wall. Lights and props were minimal. Kwon Chul opened the door himself. He was a stocky build, medium height, with a short gray-streaked haircut and the look of someone who had been used to reading people before they sat down for 20 years. Kwon Chul shook Kai's hand firmly without pausing. Kai sat down in a chair instead of on the couch, so as not to create a sense of relaxation that he didn't feel and didn't want to feign. Kwon Chul turned on the recording without warning and started with simple questions. Where is Kai from? What does he do? How did he meet Shin AI? Kai's response was smooth and concise. Then the questions got longer, and each one contained a detail that Kai had learned from the archives, a thread that led to a story. Kwon Chul asked how Kai felt about living in an environment that was different from where he came from. The question was not humiliating, but almost philosophical. This was where the real interview began. Kai honestly admitted that there was a difference, and he could see it. In this environment, the rules are different not because of other people, but because of other bets and the history of these bets. This does not make some people better than others, but only reflects different ways of assessing risk. Kwon Chul listened and made pencil notes in his notebook, not a transcript, but something of his own. This was followed by a cautious question about the Shin family through a general question about the corporate culture in large family holdings. Kai answered carefully. Any large structure carries inertia. This is not the specifics of a particular family, family, but the physics of large systems. The difference between those who work with this inertia and those who hide in it is visible not in the statements, but in who they take along at a difficult moment. Kwon Cole looked up from his notebook and stared for a few seconds, not like a journalist looking at a source, but like one person looking at another. He noted that this is an interesting answer, not praising, but as they say when they receive something unexpected. The interview ended an hour later. Kwon Cole shook Kai's hand again and said, almost casually, that it was hard not to lose yourself in this environment, but Kai seemed to be doing well so far. Kai thanked him and went outside. Jungno greeted Kai with the evening noise and street lights on the wet sidewalk. Kai paused for a second, just stood there without the next item. The interview went the way he wanted, honestly and on his own terms. Kai's phone vibrated. I received a message from Shin AI, one line with a question about how it went. Kai replied that he was fine and that Kwon Cole was asking the right questions. The answer came quickly, also in one line. She knew that, and that was why she'd chosen him. Kai put the phone away. The street lights came on in Gyeongno, and the light fell in long orange streaks on the wet pavement. He thought about Kwon Chul's words on the way out and how Shin AI, when choosing a journalist, chose not just a media resource, but a mirror in which she wanted to see something real. Kai walked to the subway station, thinking that this contract, which had started out as a deal between strangers, was becoming something indefinite. Not friendship, too soon and too much tension. Not just work, too many honest moments. Something in between that needed attention, not definition. The next official release was in 5 days. Kai thought of it even now not as a job that needed to be lived through, but as a point where something would change again. He wanted to be ready for this, not from the paper in the envelope, but for real. The invitation came not through the secretary or through the official channel, but just a message from an unfamiliar number from the tire team with an attached file. Inside was an invitation to a private fundraiser for Seoul Capital Entrepreneurs Foundation, which was scheduled to take place on Friday at Park 91 Private Club in Gangnam. The dress code is business formal. Below was a single line written in the secretary's handwriting on top of the printout that attendance was mandatory. Shin AI would be there and Kai would be there. Kai immediately noticed the foundation's logo. He had seen Seoul Capital in the archives he had read in the early days. This is the youth wing of Chan Holding. Formally, the foundation was independent, but in fact it served as a platform for strengthening ties between the heirs of large families. Charity there was not a goal, but a format, a backdrop behind which what mattered happened. Kai wrote to the secretary to ask why Shin AI would accept the invitation if the foundation was connected to the yachts. The answer came in an hour later. That's why. Kai put the phone away and started to prepare. Friday was 3 days away. He went back to the archives and this time studied the chronicle of events, who attended the Seoul Capital parties, how the seating arrangements were built, and what deals were announced on the sidelines 2 or 3 weeks after. It was a working tool disguised as a social event, and each such tool had its own logic. Kai wanted to understand this logic before he entered the hall. On the second day of training, he came across a 2-year-old story about the scandal at one of Seoul Capital's evenings. A guest took a closed-door conversation between 2 directors on the phone, and the recording leaked. After that, the Park 91 Club introduced a new protocol. The phones of all guests are withdrawn at the entrance without exception. Kai reread the note, closed his laptop, and just sat by the window for a while. The no-phone protocol meant one thing. Everything that happens inside stays inside. Or so those who set up the rule thought. Where people are sure that they are not being filmed, they behave differently, talk more, show more, sometimes too much. He took the notebook and wrote a single line at the bottom of the page. Watch, don't react. On Friday, the car picked up Kai at 8 o'clock in the evening. He was ready for 7:45 in a dark blue suit, shirt without tie, and shoes. Kai looked in the mirror just long enough to make sure everything was in place, then picked up his coat and left. Shin AI was in the car, which was unexpected since they usually arrived separately. She was sitting by the far window, wearing a maroon dress with a closed top and small black stone earrings. Her hair was pulled back more tightly than usual, and her eyes were focused on the window. When Kai got into the car, Shin AI didn't turn around right away. She said that this evening will be more difficult than the previous ones, not because of the number of people, but because of the specific goal. Jang Minsu was about to announce a partnership with 2 European foundations, and it was important for her to be present to see the event and to be seen there. Kai asked her if there were any other reasons for her presence. Then Shin AI turned to him, her eyes dark and very straight in the half-light of the car. She said that she wants Minsu to know that everything he does, she sees, and that's enough. Kai nodded, and the car pulled into Gangnam. The Park 91 Club didn't look like a club from the outside. It was an old building in a quiet alley with a dark facade and a small brass plaque by the door. Inside, there were high ceilings with caissons, dark wood walls, and a long hall with several levels of of lighting. Cold white light on top, warm amber around the perimeter, and a space between them where everyone looked a little better than they really were. At the entrance, security seized the phones politely, without explanation, and handed a small cloth bag with a personal tag. Kai calmly handed over the phone, but it didn't bother him. The hall was about 2/3 full. There were no seats. The free movement format gave an advantage to those who knew how to navigate in space. Against the far wall was a small stage with a microphone for announcements. Jang Minsu was already there in a light jacket, surrounded by 3 men who were laughing at the same time and with the same intonation. Shin Ai took a glass from the waiter's tray and walked into the hall with the confidence of someone who knows that they are being watched, and that's normal. Kai was walking beside him, just to the left, not behind or in front, but right next to him. The first 20 minutes were like a warm-up, a few short conversations, a standard mutual study, a couple of acquaintances through Shin Ai. One of the men with an expensive watch and a particularly casual gesture asked Kai directly which foundation he was from. The question was specifically about the foundation, as if there was no other way to exist in this hall. Kai replied that he was not from the foundation. Exactly. Without a smile or excuses. The man blinked as if he'd heard something in a foreign language and switched to Shin Ai. Kai noticed this and did not interfere. The time was not yet right. Around 9 in the evening, Jang Minsu went up on stage. He spoke confidently and loudly, with a well-modulated voice and well-honed diction. Minsu announced the signing of a partnership agreement with 2 European investment funds, named them amounts and directions. The audience listened carefully and applauded in the right places. The demonstration was designed exactly as people who have been taught to be the center of attention since childhood can do. Kai watched Minsu, not the words, but the gestures, the pauses. He noticed that 2 of the 3 men standing next to Minsu had moved to the side wall and were talking in low voices with their backs to the hall. One of them looked at the stage several times, not with admiration, but with an expression of expectation of a particular moment. Kai quietly asked Shin Ai who it was. She looked in that direction without turning her head completely and reported that it was CEO Juno and his assistant. CEO Juno was the manager of one of the European funds that Minsu had just named as partners. Kai watched them for a few more seconds. CEO Junho was standing relaxed, but the fingers of his right hand were gripping the glass tighter than usual, and he wasn't looking at the stage, but at the exit. Kai began to understand the situation, not completely, but enough. After the speech, Minsu walked off the stage. CEO Junho walked up to him, shook his hand, and smiled. It looked like a standard scene. However, CEO Junho's assistant stepped aside, took something out of his jacket pocket, and passed it to the small man by the wall quickly and unobtrusively, as if he was passing something that he didn't want to be seen. Kai followed the man to the wall. He went to the side corridor exit, paused, and began scanning something on the screen of a small pocket-sized tablet that had obviously been smuggled in separately from the phone. The withdrawal protocol applied only to smartphones. Kai fully understood the situation. He took his time. He waited 3 minutes, then quietly informed Shin Ai that he would be leaving for a while. She looked at him with a question in her eyes, but didn't say a word. Kai was already moving. The side corridor was dimly lit, with a few sconces on the walls and a dark carpet underfoot. A man with a clipboard was standing by a pillar at the far end. Kai walked over slowly and stopped beside her, as if just to take a break from the gym. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a screen, open correspondence with a long thread, with CEO Junho's name on the top line, and a package of documents clearly prepared before the evening. The man looked up and saw Kai, an unfamiliar face that wasn't looking at him, but at the wall. He put the tablet back in his pocket and went back to the gym. Kai stayed in the hallway for another 30 seconds, thinking about what he'd seen. CEO Juno, the partner that Minsu had just named publicly, handed over the documents to his man before the speech ended. This meant one thing. The agreement announced as Minsu's personal achievement had already been finalized on different terms. The triumphant announcement was a theater on top of a deal in which Minsu was not the lead, but the scenery. Kai returned to the hall. Shin Ai was standing in the same spot. Next to her now was Minsu, who was leaning forward and talking about funds and numbers with the air of a winner sharing a good mood. Kai came to stand beside her. Minsu glanced at him and then went back to Shin Ai. Kai listened for a few seconds. Minsu spoke confidently, but partially incorrectly. Kai knew that now. He spoke calmly, without raising his voice, with the flat intonation of a clarifying question. Kai asked Minsu exactly how the agreement with the co-fund is drawn up, through a direct partnership or through an intermediary structure, since for European funds of this type, the difference in design affects who actually controls the exit conditions. The small bubble of their conversation became silent. The smile on Minsu's face didn't disappear immediately, but it became slower, like a screen that starts to slow down. Minsu said that this is a technical issue that is not discussed at evenings of this format. Kai nodded and added exactly that he understood, just clarifying, because he had heard that Seo Junho had already prepared the documentation for his side before the announcement. He was wondering if this is a standard practice or a feature of a particular framework. The silence lasted a little longer than necessary for a neutral pause. Minsu looked over his shoulder to where Seo Junho was standing. Seo Junho was talking to someone else, but their eyes crossed, and both of them realized at the same time that something had changed. Minsu turned back around. His face changed, the smile remained, but his eyes worked differently. He said briefly that it was private information and changed the subject. Kai didn't press the point. He took a half step back, giving Minsu space, and turned his attention to the conversation next to him. The job was done. The question was asked aloud at the right time and in the right place, and now the three people in the audience knew that someone knew. Shin Ai didn't look at Kai. She held her glass steady and spoke to someone on her left without changing her position or tempo. But when they were standing side by side at the end of the hall a few minutes later, she quietly told him exactly what he'd seen in the hallway. Kai briefly described the tablet, the transfer of documents, and the thread with Seo Junho's name on the top line. He noted that he hadn't seen the full content, but the context was clear. Shin Ai was silent for a few seconds, then said flatly that this explained something that she had noticed over the past 2 months but couldn't put together. She said it without gratitude, just like someone who had received the missing piece. Kai asked her what she was going to do with this information. She looked at him directly and told him bluntly that she wasn't going to do anything tonight. Everything that needs to happen has already happened. Minsu knows that someone saw it. Seo Junho knows that Minsu knows. This is enough to make their deal start to unravel from the inside without her involvement. It wasn't cruelty, but precision. The evening began to fade. Minsu didn't approach them again. Seo Junho left the hall early. Kai noticed that. In the car on the way home, Shin Ai, without looking at Kai, said that what he did with the question about the agreement was accurate. No unnecessary words, no premature ones. Exactly. Kai stared out the window, watching Gangnam gradually recede. Shop windows, streetlights, black cars at expensive entrances flashing in the reflection. He reflected on what he had done today. He hadn't openly destroyed anything, and he hadn't come into conflict. Kai just asked the question at the right moment, and that question did the rest. The car stopped at Sangwon residence. Kai opened the door, but didn't come out right away. He turned to Shin Ai and quietly asked if there was anything in her surroundings that she had been observing for 2 months but couldn't put together. Shin Ai looked at him for a second. There was something in her eyes that wasn't exactly alarm or surprise, but rather a sense of being confronted by a man who had become a little more dangerous than she had expected. It wasn't clear if this was a good thing or a bad thing. She admitted that it was possible and added that she would tell you tomorrow. Kai nodded, got out of the car, and closed the door. He stood at the entrance to the complex, watching the car until the taillights disappeared around the bend. The next morning, Kai woke up before the alarm went off. He made coffee, opened his laptop, and found what he was looking for. 3 years ago, the So Foundation signed an agreement with a holding company that gave it the right to priority share buybacks under certain conditions. The parent structure of the holding coincided with one of the structures of the Shin family. Seo wasn't Minsu's casual partner, but a person with positions in the Shin family's orbit, positions that Minsu probably didn't know about when he went on stage. At 10:30, Kai received a message from Shin Ai, one word, when. He said it was now. She sent the address. It wasn't a club or a business center, but an ordinary apartment building in a quiet area. The apartment was on the 4th floor. The door was opened by Shin Ai herself, without any helpers or guards. She was wearing jeans and a light sweater, and her hair wasn't pulled back. Kai walked into a small hallway that smelled of brewed tea. This was her private apartment, not an executive one. It was small, with bookshelves along one wall and a desk by the window piled high with papers. On the windowsill were 2 pots of plants, one of which clearly needed water. Kai told Shin Ai about his findings, briefly and in fact, the structure of the So Fund, the 3-year agreement, the relationship with the Shin family's assets. She listened without interrupting, her fingers tapping the cup in a familiar rhythm. After his story, she was silent for about 10 seconds, then admitted that she knew about this agreement in general terms, but did not suspect that Seo used it as leverage in negotiations with Minsu. Kai asked how critical Ko's position is in the asset structure. Shin Ai got up, opened her laptop, and displayed a corporate diagram with nodes and arrows on the screen. She pointed to one of the assets and explained that it was the key asset for the deal, which her father plans to close next quarter. If the Ko gets the opportunity to block approval, the transaction will fall apart. Kai asked her if she had spoken to her father. Shin Ai closed her laptop and informed her that her father considered Seo a reliable player, an opinion he had been been building for 2 years. She couldn't speculate without facts. Kai asked how much time was left. She said 6 weeks. For the first time, there was a strain in her voice that she couldn't quickly hide. Kai sat on the couch and stared at her straight back, her fingers taking up the cup again, and her calm face hiding something complicated. At that moment, she showed him something real, not on purpose, but because there was no other way out. He calmly said that 6 weeks was enough if you knew where to look. Shin Ai looked at him as if she was reassessing the situation. Then she quietly admitted that she didn't hire Seo to do it. Kai replied that he knew, and added that if she decided to go in that direction, he would need access to the public registers of Ko's partner structures, the ones that are publicly available. He'll do the rest himself. She stared at him for a long time, longer than usual. Then she got up, picked up a thin hardcover notebook from the shelf, and handed it to him. On the first page was a list of links and a few names. Kai realized that she had thought about this before, but she didn't have anyone who was willing to go that route. He picked up the notebook and put it in his pocket. Get up. At the door, Shin Ai quietly told him to be careful. Kai didn't turn around, but paused in the doorway for a moment to let those words go unanswered. He went out. It was a normal day outside. Kai walked to the subway station with his notebook in his pocket and reflected that this contract had started out as a screen. Somewhere between the first dinner and this apartment with a pot on the windowsill, he became a lever that one person gave to another, not because it was written in the agreement, but because there was no choice. He took out his notebook, opened the first page, and began reading the names on the way to the station. Kai studied the notebook all night. The names on the first page were names of people, not structures. That was immediately obvious. There were no legal names for holdings or funds, but 4 names, each with 1 or 2 markings. One is an auditor who worked for the Shin family before leaving 2 years ago. The second is a former employee of the legal department of one of the partner holdings. The third is a name without a position, only the area of residence and year. The fourth is a woman marked intermediary and a question mark. Kai read the list for a long time, then closed his notebook and went to bed. He couldn't fall asleep quickly, lying in the dark and thinking that Shin Ai hadn't made this list recently. The paper was a little frayed around the edges, and the handwriting matched what was in the first envelopes, but it looked more hurried. This list existed long before him. In the morning, Kai texted her that he was ready to work on the list and needed one question in person. 20 minutes later, the answer came. Today at 6 o'clock in the evening, in the same place, in the same apartment, in the same tea-scented hallway. Shin Ai opened the door in the same sweater, but her hair was pulled back, twisted and pinned back, like they do when they don't have time to mess around. There were fewer papers on the desk, but there were 2 cups, one obviously for Kai. He sat down on the same sofa, picked up a cup, and directly asked how long the list had been around. Shin Ai was standing by the window with her back to him. She was silent for a few seconds, choosing her words, then admitted that the list had been around for about 6 months. From the moment, she began to realize that something was wrong with her father's environment. Kai asked what it was. She turned and walked over to the sofa, but instead of sitting down next to it, she picked up a chair and sat down across from it, closer than usual. It was the attitude of a man who was ready to speak directly. She started with the facts. 6 months ago, during a routine audit of its internal financial statements, it found a discrepancy in one of its operating segments. Small, almost imperceptible, but systematic. Each quarter, one item of expenditure grew slightly faster than was explained by official reasons. She raised this issue with her father, who said that this is a normal variation and the audit will confirm everything. The audit confirmed it. Kai asked if the same auditor was at the top of her list. Shin Ai looked at him quickly and carefully and nodded. After that, she began to look more broadly not at reporting, but at people. She was looking for those who make decisions that bypass standard coordination, who coordinate partners associated with G or similar structures. Gradually, a contour emerged, not a conspiracy with a name, but a dense network of people who have known each other for a long time and make each other comfortable. Her father was inside this network, but she wasn't sure if he was fully aware of it, or if he was a convenient hub, unaware that everything was built around him. Kai asked her what she was thinking now. She took the cup, looked into it, and quietly replied that it was more likely the latter. Her father was not a participant, but a resource. They show him one painting, while they build another behind it. The room fell silent. Outside, a light November rain was falling, pattering steadily on the windowsill. Kai said slowly, which means that a contract with So is not just a defense against marital marriage. Shin Ai looked up, paused briefly but sincerely, and said no. Not only that. Kai waited. She explained smoothly and without further ado that she needed someone outside of this system, not from the family, not from the business environment, not connected to the circle of people that she was beginning to see. The contract gave her the opportunity to have such a person around without explaining to anyone why they were there. Kai listened, watching her hold hold the cup tightly in both hands, and thought it was both smart and very lonely to have such a precise plan and still have to hire a stranger because there was no one else. He asked if there was anyone she trusted inside the family. Shin AI didn't respond immediately. She said that she has a cousin who is not engaged in business, but works as an architect and lives in another city. They rarely communicate, but in extreme cases, she knows that he will be on her side. Kai nodded and recorded the information. The conversation turned into a working course. They discussed specific steps, the first names from the list, who can be addressed, and from what angle to approach. The first-line auditor, Lee Sang-go, now worked for an independent consulting firm in the north of the city. Kai suggested that we start with him, studying public information about his activities, rather than making direct contact. Shin AI agreed and said that it has access to some closed corporate registries, and it can get data through legitimate requests without attracting attention. They worked for another hour or so, talking quietly, sometimes interrupting each other, but not aggressively, but like people whose thoughts were going in the same direction from different directions. Kai went from structure to people, Shin AI from people to structure, which gave them a lot of information. At one point, Shin AI got up to pick up a notebook from the table and accidentally bumped her shoulder against the lamp on the work table by the sofa. The lamp swayed, but it didn't fall. Kai instinctively raised his hand and held it down without getting up. His hand and Shin AI simultaneously touched the lamp for a split second. She let go first and took a step back. They didn't comment on this moment, but something changed in the room weightlessly, like the pressure changes before a real rain. When Kai was about to leave, Shin AI walked him to the door, stopped at the threshold, leaned her shoulder against the jamb, and looked at him, telling him that she wasn't used to trusting him without planning. Kai thought for a second and said that he wasn't used to it either, but sometimes the list ends and only the person next to him remains. Shin AI stared at him for a few seconds, then quietly admitted that it was uncomfortable. Kai smiled sincerely and agreed. He said goodbye and left. For the next 3 days, Kai worked through the list. Lee Sang-go's auditor turned out to be more interesting than he first appeared. After leaving the Shin structure, he changed 3 consulting companies in 2 years, and none of them was large enough to pay him the salary that he clearly received. In the lists of participants at 2 industry conferences, he was placed on the same panel as a representative of the CO Juno-related organization. Kai compiled all the facts and chronology into a short document and sent it to Shin AI. 40 minutes later, she replied with a single line, "He can come now." This time, Shin AI opened the door differently, like a person who was thinking right before the bell rang. There was something shifted in her gaze. Several parts suddenly snapped into place, and the landscape became both clearer and heavier. She led Kai to the work table. For the first time, not on the couch, but there. I opened my laptop and put his document and my notes next to it. She noted that the timeline for Lee Sang-go coincides with the dates of 2 internal approvals, which she couldn't explain before, but now she could. They worked side by side, almost shoulder to shoulder, both of them looking at the screen. At some point, Shin AI found the right document, leaned closer, and her hair brushed against Kai's shoulder. She didn't move away, and neither did he. They worked like this for a few minutes, close together, in a common rhythm, even though it had been less than a month since they'd met. Then Shin AI found what she was looking for, leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes for a second, and just exhaled. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Kai. She said this meant that the scheme had been around longer than she thought. Not 2 years, but at least 4. Kai was silent. For years wasn't CO Juno's local position, but a long game. He asked in what year Shin AI's father started actively expanding partnerships outside of Korea. She said it was 4 years and 3 months ago. They looked at each other synchronously, without words, like people who simultaneously saw the same thing from different angles. Shin AI then got up and went to the window. The rain had picked up, pounding on the window, blurring the street lights into blurry lines. Kai stared at her silhouette, the straight back and straight shoulders that she held even when she thought no one was looking. She turned and walked over to the couch and sat down next to him for the first time that evening. Not in front of him, not in a separate chair, but next to him, just a hand's breadth away. I opened the last file on my laptop and turned the screen to him. On the screen was a corporate graph with nodes, arrows, and handwritten notes. She pointed to one of the nodes, a place she hadn't been able to close for 6 months. If you close this node, the whole scheme adds up. According to her assumption, this node is the 4th name, a female intermediary with a question mark. Kai leaned closer, his shoulder brushing hers, and he felt it. She didn't move, just stared at the screen, but her breathing became a little quieter and more noticeable. He asked her what she knew about the middleman. Shin AI replied that this is a woman who does not appear publicly and is not officially listed anywhere. Her father mentioned her name once by accident, thinking she wasn't listening. For 3 months, she searched for a link and found one. An an signed article from 2 years ago in the comments to which someone mentioned this name, but immediately deleted it. Kai said that if you can find at least one transaction with this name, the chain will go on its own. Shin AI closed her laptop and leaned back on the couch, her head tilted slightly to the left as she stared at the ceiling. Kai sat beside her in silence. This moment didn't require words. She'd shown him the whole machine she'd been carrying for 6 months, and now she was just breathing. He looked at her, at the line of her cheek in the lamplight, at the hair that had escaped from its clip, at her fingers resting loosely on her knee. This was a man who was tired of pretending not to be tired. She felt his gaze, turned her head slowly, and looked at him from a hand's breadth away. Her eyes were alive in the light. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then she said quietly that he knew how dangerous what they were doing was. Kai answered in the affirmative. She noted that this does not stop him. He confirmed it. She looked away slowly, the way you look away not from something unpleasant, but from something that takes too long to look at. Shin AI got up and went to the window again. The rain was falling steadily. She said that the contract ends in 2 months, and after that she does not have the right to keep him in this situation. If he wants to get out, now is the right time, while it's still simple. Kai came to stand beside her at the window. He could see her face in the reflection. He said he wouldn't leave. She said very quietly that it changed the contract. He replied that then let him change it. The rain was falling steadily, and the street lights were blurred in the glass. They were standing at the window, a short distance away, which they both felt physically, like the space between 2 charges. She didn't move toward him. He didn't move toward her. They just stood there. Then she told him to go home. He needed a fresh head tomorrow. Kai looked at her reflection one last time, nodded, and picked up his notebook and coat. At the door, he paused for a second, as he always did. The door closed. As he walked down the stairs, he thought about how Shin AI had been carrying this alone for half a year, and the only thing she had allowed herself to do today was not hold her shoulders straight for a few seconds. It was a lot for her. The next morning, Kai got up early, sat by the window with his coffee, and looked out at the avenue below. He thought about her specifically, without romanticizing, about how she called a spade, especially when it was inconvenient. He appreciated that. On Friday, there was a photo shoot in a spacious, cold studio. The photographer gave precise instructions: live shots, contact, minimal posing. Shin AI was wearing dark race slacks and a cream blouse, and her hair was loose. She said hello and nodded to Kai with a slight tension that still lingered after the frank conversation. When the photographer asked him to just talk about something, Kai turned to Shin AI and quietly told her that he had found a clue from the 4th name in the notebook, a corporate registration in Singapore 3 years ago, a name as a co-owner in a 3rd-level structure. She looked at him, first with mild surprise, then with the precise attention with which she handled important things. She asked in a low voice where exactly. Kai answered. The photographer took pictures without hearing, but recorded that 2 people were standing close, one looking at the other with a concentration that is not accidental. There was something solid between them, visible through the lens. After the session at the studio window, Shin AI said without intro that she was thinking about what Kai said the day before yesterday. It is important, but she wants him to understand. She doesn't know how to do it casually. When he lets someone in for real, it's all or nothing. Kai stared at her, at the direct gaze and the slight tension in the line of his mouth. She didn't speak out of fear of his reaction, but out of respect to tell the truth beforehand. He said he understood, and he wasn't the type to enter without an intention of staying. Shin AI nodded once, briefly. In front of the car, she pulled up next to him. In the November light, with a cream blouse and wind in her hair, she said the list had been reduced to a single intermediary name. If they find him, everything else will add up. Kai said they would. Shin AI entered the car. Kai watched the door close, then turned up the collar of his jacket and headed for the subway. There was only one name, one knot, and 2 months left in his mind, which no longer seemed like a clear-cut time frame. Kai reflected that it was a good thing that he wasn't afraid of something that didn't have a name. He found a lead in Singapore through a public corporate registry, spending one evening on it and using the right search queries. The name of the female intermediary was listed as a co-owner in a 3rd-level shell company registered 3 years ago. The company was engaged in consulting in the field of mergers and acquisitions, a broad enough profile to not attract attention. Kai wrote down the registration number, the date of foundation, and the name of the second co-owner. The second co-owner was a man, Korean by name. Kai checked it through several databases, but to no avail. The name didn't appear anywhere in the public context. This was already information. People with money and positions are either very visible or deliberately invisible. This one was of the second type. Kai sent all the information to Shin AI around 11:30 in the morning. She replied at midnight in one line. Tomorrow morning at 9 at her place. Kai arrived at the appointed time. There was hot coffee on the table, for him, in the same cup. Shin AI sat up straight, a clipboard in her hand hand, and the expression of someone who hadn't had enough sleep but wasn't going to complain. Kai immediately asked her what she had found. Shin AI placed the tablet on the table between them and swiped her finger across the screen. It had the second co-owner's name on it, Korean, male, and a few handwritten notes from her. She admitted that she did not know this name from the registers, but had heard it as a child. Kai watched her carefully and waited. She explained that this name belonged to a person whom the family considered a close friend and not a business partner or associate. This man had been at their house when she was a child, had known her father for 20 years, and had attended her mother's funeral. Kai asked her when she had last seen him. Shin AI thought about it and said that it was about 3 years ago at a corporate dinner. He showed up briefly, greeted his father, and left before anyone else. It seemed insignificant at the time. 3 years ago, a Singapore-based company was registered. Kai and Shin AI didn't say it out loud, but they both knew that the timeline spoke for itself. Shin AI got up and went to the window. Outside, it was a gray morning with heavy clouds and no wind. She stood there for a few seconds, then turned around and said she didn't think she'd go this far inside. Kai cautiously asked if she was referring to the investigation or something else. She stared at him for a long time and then replied that she was both. The room fell silent. Kai held the cup and thought about what she'd just said, about his presence here, in this apartment, in this proximity. It wasn't a complaint or a warning, but just the truth that a person utters when they stop holding it back. Kai didn't answer right away, and then quietly noted that sometimes something that goes further than planned isn't a mistake. Shin AI looked at him without agreement or denial, with the expression of someone who has already accepted something inside, but has not yet found the form for it outside. She went back to her desk, opened her laptop, and said that she needed to find out exactly how this person was connected to Seo Junho and Lee Sanho, whether directly or through an intermediary, which is the fundamental difference. Kai agreed, and the work continued. Over the next 2 days, they conducted a parallel search. Shin AI through closed databases with legitimate access, Kai manually through public registries. On the third day, around 2:30, Kai found the document that covered the diagram. The name OM Chien appeared in the minutes of the shareholders' meeting of a small Hong Kong holding company 5 years ago. The same protocol also included the name of Lee Sango, who was still working in the Shin structure at the time, and in the power of attorney section, the name of the law firm Seo Junho founded before his current position. All 4 dots from the notebook appeared in a single document from 5 years ago. Kai stared at the screen for a long time, then texted Shin AI what he found and offered to meet up. She told him to come. Kai arrived 20 minutes later. Shin AI opened the door with the expression that comes before confirming something big, not relief or fear, but something in between. Kai went to the desk, opened his laptop, and showed the document. Shin AI silently read, reread, went into details, and returned to the names. Kai didn't rush her, knowing that she wasn't looking at the text, but at 5 years of family history and finding things in it that she hadn't noticed before. When she looked up, there were no tears in her eyes. She didn't allow herself to do that in a work context, but there was something different in them, a hardness and certainty. She said that OM Chien had known his father for 20 years. If this is true, and it is, then he has been building positions all this time, slowly, within the trust that his father gave him for free because they were friends. Kai was silent, knowing that this didn't require any comment. Shin AI added softly, almost to herself, that her father wouldn't believe her. Kai noted that this is why we need not an analysis, but a document that speaks for itself, something that cannot be interpreted otherwise. They have a chronology and a name match, but this is not enough for a conversation with a father. You need a transaction or protocol in which OM Chien acts as an explicit party to an operation that is directed against the interests of the family. Shin AI nodded and said that there was one person, an external independent lawyer who knew how to work with private data through legitimate channels, one of the few who had never worked with the family directly. Kai asked how much he could be trusted. She replied that the lawyer had no reason to be loyal to anyone but her. Shin AI wrote to the lawyer that evening. At 10:30 the next day, they met at his office in Madpo. The office was located in a small building in a quiet alley with a small sign. Inside was a study with 3 shelves, a large desk, and a functional computer. The lawyer, Harkanu, is a man in his mid-50s, thin, with thin glasses, and the kind of concentrated look that comes from people who work a lot with documents. Shin AI laid out the essence without embellishment: scheme, names, chronology, purpose. Harkanu listened and made pencil notes. After her story, he asked her if she was prepared for the fact that if the document was found, the situation would become public, not immediately, but inevitably. Shin AI replied that she was ready. Harkanu nodded and got to work. 40 minutes later, Kai and Shin AI were sitting by the wall in silence, each in their own thoughts. Sometimes Sometimes Kai could sense her looking in his direction, but he didn't turn around. Park In-woo also said that he found a 2-year-old corporate transaction, the transfer of management rights to one of the Shin family's small assets through an intermediary structure. The name of the intermediary in the registry is OM Chien. Legal support was provided by a company affiliated with CO Juno. It was an official register, a publicly available document, not an interpretation. The office fell silent. Shin Ai sat up straight, her hands motionless in her lap. Kai watched her profile, the line of her shoulder, the way she held her face straight without breaking. She accepted it as one accepts something difficult that one has been preparing for a long time. Park In-woo printed out the document and placed it in front of her. She picked it up, looked at it, and set it down on the table. She asked not to transmit information to anyone and not to take any action without her signal. Park In-woo agreed, and they went out. It was quiet and overcast outside in Madpo. They walked slowly down the alley to the car. Shin Ai carried the document in her hand, not putting it in her bag, as if she wasn't sure where to put it. Kai kept quiet and let her keep quiet. She stopped in front of the car, not opening the door, and stared at the asphalt. Then she said quietly that she thought that when she found it, she would feel something sharp, anger or relief, but she only felt heavy. Kai noted that heaviness is an honest reaction. She looked up at him with an open expression that rarely appeared when a person lost control of their face. She said he could have walked out of it at any time and knows it. Kai said he knew. She asked why he hadn't left. Kai thought for a moment, then answered honestly that it was because he wanted to know how it would end, and because he didn't like leaving where he was needed. Shin Ai stared at him for a second longer, then opened the car door and got in. Kai sat down next to her. Beyond the windows, the quiet residential lanes of Madpo stretched away, and the trees were leafless. She was looking ahead, holding the document in her hands, and he was looking out the window. After a few minutes, she said that she needed to talk to her father, but not now. It would take a few days, because this conversation could not be missed. Kai said that he understood and added that he would be there when needed. Shin Ai nodded once. The next 2 days passed quietly. Kai did not leave the apartment and did not participate in any activities. He was engaged in compiling a chronology of events in such a way that it could be passed on to another person, coherently, evidently, without assumptions. This was preparation for Shin Ai's father. If she decided to talk, she had to have something that couldn't be put off. Shin Ai didn't write these 2 days, and Kai didn't rush her. On the 3rd day, she wrote that she was expecting him at 7 o'clock to have dinner with her. The apartment smelled like home-cooked food, the warm aroma of soy sauce and ginger. Shin Ai was standing by the stove in the far corner of the kitchen, wearing jeans and a sweater. There were 2 plates on the table. Kai walked into the kitchen and stopped at the bar. She said that everything was almost ready and offered to sit down. Kai asked her what she was cooking. Shin Ai replied that it was doenjang jjigae. She learned how to cook this dish from a domestic worker at an early age after the death of her mother. The housekeeper prepared it every Friday, and now Shin Ai prepared it herself when she needed to think calmly. Kai took it as a fact, not appreciating it. Over dinner, they talked about something else. Kai said that he grew up in Incheon, on the outskirts of the city, where his father worked in a factory and his mother worked in the school cafeteria. He had 2 brothers, and the house was crowded and noisy. Shin Ai said that she read a lot as a child, because after her mother's death, the house became quiet and books did not demand anything in return. Kai watched her and thought that she was different in this apartment, no less collected, but freer. After dinner, Shin Ai brought tea to the sofa, put down 2 cups, and was silent for a long time. Then she said that she had decided to talk to her father this week, not because she was ready, but because every day of waiting increased the risk that something would move without her control. Kai nodded. She added that she wanted him to be there for her that day, not in the room, but in the city, in touch, because after the conversation, she may just need to go out and not be alone. She admitted that she understands that this is not part of the terms of their contract. Kai assured me that he would be there for me. Shin Ai looked up, looked at him for a second, nodded, and returned her gaze to her cup. When Kai left, she said quietly and without hesitation at the door that everything would be right. As he walked down the stairs, Kai thought that she wasn't saying this to comfort him. It wasn't a confidence in the outcome, but in the direction. Such people do not need guarantees of results. They only need to know that they are going where they should. At 10:30 on Friday, Shin Ai texted that the call was scheduled for 1 o'clock in the afternoon. At a little after 2, she sent one word: get out. They met in the park next to her house, a small square with bare trees and a gray sky. Shin Ai was standing by the bench without a hat, despite the wind. When she saw Kai, she took 2 steps towards him and stopped. Her face had that peculiar blank calmness that comes after a very difficult conversation. Kai asked quietly how the conversation went. Shin Ai's father listened to her without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, and then asked where she got the materials from. She honestly replied that she she found them herself with help. Her father asked who was helping, and she named Kai. After that, he didn't ask any more questions about it. He got up, went to the window, and stood with his back to it. Then he said he needed time. Shin AI nodded and left. Kai listened to all this, and then asked her how she was feeling. Shin AI looked at him directly, unprotected, and admitted that she was tired. Almost in a whisper, she added that she was very tired. Kai took a step toward her just to be there for her. She didn't move away, just stared at him for a few seconds, then slowly lowered her head to his shoulder. Without words or explanation, just tired and lowered it. Kai stood still, not hugging her, just being there, giving her what she'd taken herself. Park with bare trees, gray sky, and cold November. A few passers-by went about their business. They stood there for about a minute. Then Shin AI straightened up, pushed her hair out of her face, and said flatly that we should go out to eat because she hadn't had breakfast. Kai agreed. They walked side by side down the alley, taking their time. He didn't take her hand. She didn't take his, but the distance between them was minimal, shoulder almost touching shoulder, like people who don't need to explain it. Kai thought about what had happened over the past few weeks. The contract that had started out as a deal, the notebook that had existed before him, Park In-woo's document, the conversation with his father, and the fact that the man who had just done perhaps the most difficult thing in his life was walking beside him and still walking straight. The end of the contract was less than 2 months away. This time limit no longer mattered as much as it had in the beginning. Something has long gone beyond it, quietly, without announcements, as everything real goes. Shin AI's father called himself, not through my secretary or my daughter, but from my personal number on Sunday morning at 9:30. Kai saw an unfamiliar number and picked up the phone. The voice was low and without any extra intonation, such as happens with people who are used to being listened to from the first sentence. He introduced himself as Shin Hanek and said that he would like to meet today if Kai didn't mind. He gave me the address, not a corporate office or a club, but a private restaurant in Seoul where they go their own, without random people. Kai agreed. Shin Hanek made an appointment for 1 o'clock in the afternoon and hung up. Kai put the phone down on the table and stared at it for a few seconds. Then he texted Shin AI again, telling her that her father had just called and made an appointment at 1 o'clock in Seoul. 2 minutes later, the answer came. She knew. Then another message. He called in person, so he's serious. Kai put the phone away and started to prepare. The restaurant in Seoul looked like a private house that had accidentally become a place to eat. A one-story building with dark wooden shutters and a narrow courtyard behind a low fence. There were no signs outside. Inside, there were several tables, cloth partitions between the zones, and the smell of long-used wood and hot broth. Shin Hanek was already seated when Kai entered. He recognized him at once, not from the photos from the archive, but from the way he sat, straight, calm, with that tight, rooted immobility that comes from people who have long known that they don't have to hurry anywhere. The man was in his mid-60s, wearing a dark gray jacket, a short, neat haircut, and thin-rimmed glasses. He looked at Kai without getting up, without warmth or cold, just with precise and calm attention. Kai came over and said hello. Shin Hanek nodded and pointed to the chair opposite. For the first few minutes, they ordered food slowly, reading the menu carefully. Kai noticed that Shin Hanek didn't take the food as a formality. He was actually going to eat, which indicated that he was working properly. When the waiter left, Shin Hanek looked at Kai and asked without preamble how long he had known his daughter. Kai honestly replied that it was about a month. Shin Hanek noted that during this month, she showed Kai things that she hadn't shown anyone else. It wasn't a question. Kai said that she showed what she thought was necessary. Shin Hanek stared at him for a few seconds, then said quietly and without pressure that his daughter was not an easy person. Not many people know this because she doesn't show it, but he does. He'd seen her deal with things that made others break down, which is why what she did this week, coming to him with these materials, was more precious to her than anyone on the outside could understand. Kai listened without comment. Shin Hanek continued that he spent 2 days checking the materials he brought, not because he didn't trust his daughter, but because he couldn't afford to act on anything untested when a 20-year relationship was at stake. He checked everything, and it all matched up. Park In-woo's document is not the only one. When he started looking from this point of view, there were 2 more. Kai calmly asked what he was going to do. Shin Hanek took a cup of tea, took a sip, and replied that he wasn't going to take any drastic action just yet. He is not a man of sudden movements in situations with a long history. First, you need to understand the full scope, and then act, so that control remains with him. Kai agreed that it was reasonable. Shin Hanek looked at him again and said that he wanted to meet not only because of the materials, but also to see the person his daughter trusts. Because AI doesn't trust people. Those are his words, not hers. She grew up in an environment where trust was expensive and rarely paid off. He bears some of the responsibility for this, as he was too busy when she was growing up. He said it without sentimentality, just as a fact that he had long ago come to terms with. Kai was silent. Shin Hanek asked what Kai wanted from the whole situation, not from his daughter, matter, but from the whole situation. It was a direct question from a person who only asked direct questions. Kai thought for a second to answer accurately and said that his interest was to make sure everything ended up right. Not profitable for someone, but right. More specifically, he doesn't want Shin AI to be left alone after all this, with consequences that she shouldn't have to bear alone. Shin Hanek paused, then slowly said that this was a sufficient answer. It wasn't a compliment. It was just a statement that he accepted what he was hearing. The food was served and they started eating. The conversation became less intense. Shin Hanek became interested in real logistics, not just a topic of conversation. Kai answered to the point. For about 20 minutes, they discussed the digital transformation of supply chains professionally and without condescension on either side. Kai noted that Shin Hanek really understands the technical details, as he owns several logistics assets and closely monitors them. As they ate less and talked more, Shin Hanek quietly noted that OMGyon was probably already feeling the changes. Such people detect shifts in the atmosphere before the facts appear. This meant that there wasn't much time left. Kai asked how much. Shin Hanek replied that it would take about 10 days, 2 weeks at most, until OMGN started taking preemptive action. They may try to re-register their positions or exit structures in a way that is impossible to track. People with his experience know that the one who speaks first drives the narrative. Kai concluded that the lawyers would be needed in less than 2 weeks. Shin Hanek said that the meeting has already been scheduled for Tuesday. He wants Park In-woo to be present with the document and also Shin AI to be there, since she started this case and needs to participate. Kai asked if he needed to be present himself. Shin Hanek gave Kai a long, appraising look, then said no. This is a family and legal matter, and Kai's place is next to Shin AI before and after the meeting, but not inside it. This was a clear distinction that Kai accepted. When they were done, Shin Hanek was the first to stand up, shaking Kai's hand firmly with the same calm attention. As he put on his coat, he confessed that he didn't know what was going on between him and his daughter, and that it was none of his business. But he wanted to emphasize that Shin AI is more complex than she looks on the outside, and easier than she thinks. Kai replied that he knew that. Shin Hanek nodded and left. Kai stayed at the table for a few more minutes, finished his tea, and stared at the empty chair across from him. He reflected that a conversation that shouldn't have been easy was different. Not easy, but honest. This was better. Kai texted Shin AI that the meeting was over and everything went well. She responded almost instantly, asking him to come to her. Kai arrived. Shin AI immediately asked without greeting what Shin Hanek said. Kai came in, sat down, and recounted the entire conversation in detail from the first sentence to the last. Shin AI listened while standing against the wall with her arms crossed, not closed, but as if holding something inside while listening from the outside. When Kai finished, she was silent for a long time, and then quietly reminded him of Shin Hanek's last words, that she was harder and simpler at the same time. Kai confirmed it. Shin AI looked at him and said that her father had never said anything like that to her directly. Kai remained silent, letting the words exist. She walked over to the sofa, sat down in the corner, pulled up her legs, and was silent for another minute. Then she quietly admitted that she was afraid of this conversation, not of failure or her father's reaction, but of having her suspicions confirmed. Then the world will shift a little, and it will be impossible to return to the state of ignorance. Kai was looking at her. She added that she was right, and this shift was harder than she thought. Kai said quietly that the truth is always harder than it looks, and rarely comes easily, but it is better than what replaces it. Shin AI stared at him for a long time with the expression of someone who accepts something not with her mind, but with something else that works slower. Then she just said thank you. Kai nodded. The next morning, at 8 o'clock, I received a message about a problem with a request to come. Park In-woo's assistant, a man who had worked for the lawyer for less than a year, had called a former colleague who worked for a company affiliated with one of CEO's structures the previous evening. The conversation was domestic, but the assistant mentioned that the chief is currently doing an interesting family business in Seoul. That was enough. By Monday morning, the information that something with legal implications was going on in the Shin family had reached OMGN. He didn't know the details, but it was enough of a signal to make him act. Shin AI was standing at her desk with her phone in her hand when Kai arrived. She ended the call and reported that Park In-woo had a minor, unintentional leak of information, and OMGN already knows something is going on. Kai asked what OMGN had done. Shin AI replied that she didn't know yet, but he definitely wouldn't wait. Kai sat down, picked up his notebook, and began to think quickly, but without haste. He noted that the plan does not change. The meeting is scheduled for tomorrow, and until then, OMGN will not have time to do anything irreversible. He has an alarm signal, but there are no specifics. Shin AI stressed that tomorrow's meeting should end not with a strategy, but with action. The document must be submitted to the legal procedure today before the end of the working working day. Kai agreed. She wrote to Park In and her father. Both responded within 10 minutes. My father briefly confirmed that he would be there at 9 in the morning. Park In-woo apologized for the assistant, saying that the document was ready for delivery and the procedure would begin after the meeting. Shin Ai put down her phone, exhaled, and looked at Kai with the special calmness that comes when everything is decided and you just have to act. She said they'd finish it tomorrow. Kai confirmed it. They sat for another hour or so, checking the timeline and looking for weaknesses that might be exploited by an experienced lawyer on the other side. There were no weak points. The chronology was kept. As Kai was about to leave, Shin Ai stopped him at the door, took his wrist for a second, and let him go. She looked at him and quietly admitted that she was glad he was here. Kai looked down at her fingers that had just gripped his wrist and at her open, unmasked face. He said he was glad, too. On Tuesday morning, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a message arrived that the document was ready and in process. The meeting was completed and Kai was due to arrive. He's arrived. Shin Ai opened the door and looked different. Something big was left behind, and it was seen not as fatigue, but as liberation. She poured 2 glasses of water and told him that the lawyers were good, that her father was steady, and that OM Chien didn't know exactly what was going on yet, and he wouldn't know right away. Kai asked her how she was feeling. She took a sip of water and admitted with a pause that she was a little scared. Not now, but later, when everything was over and life was back in some shape. She doesn't know what this form will look like. It also scares her that in 7 weeks the contract will end. This is also a form that she does not know. Kai put down his glass and said quietly that the contract was ending, but the one behind it wasn't. Shin Ai stared at him for a long moment, then put down her glass and asked him, almost without intonation, if he was sure. She wasn't asking about him personally, but about whether he understood what he was taking on, because she couldn't do something by halves, and 7 weeks wasn't enough. Kai replied that he was as sure as he could be in 7 weeks, and that no one else could know more. But he knows enough. Shin Ai stared at him for a second longer, then took a small step forward and stopped at a distance that was neither far nor near. Kai didn't move. She reached up and put her hand on his chest, not hugging him, just putting it there, feeling his breath. She stood there for a few seconds, then took her hand away and stepped back. She suggested smoothly and almost matter-of-factly, but with a warm intonation, not to finish the contract, but simply to continue. Kai looked at her straight back and loose hair, at the glass of water on the table, at the apartment with its bookshelves, and the plant on the windowsill that he had twice seen needing watering. He looked at it all the way one might look at something that was familiar before he noticed it. He agreed. She nodded once, briefly, then turned back to the stove to put the kettle on and casually told him to stay for dinner. She would make Dungeon Jaegi again. Kai chuckled softly to himself and agreed. He sat on the bar stool at the counter and watched her take out the pot. It was getting dark outside. November, early dusk, the lights of street lamps along the street. The contract was still 7 weeks away. The most difficult part is already over. The document in the procedure, the meeting with my father, the conversation at the kitchen counter with 2 glasses of water. Up ahead is OM Chien, who will fight back, and all that will follow. It won't be easy, but they'll be together. Kai watched her at the stove, wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair pinned up, and thought that this contract, which had started out as a screen, had become something that didn't need a screen or a name. Just 2 people. Just dinner. Just stay. Sometimes that's enough to get something really started. The article was published on Wednesday morning. Kai found out about the article before Shin Ai could write it herself. He saw the headline on the news aggregator around 7:30 in the morning while drinking coffee by the window. It was a small second-tier business publication with a good audience in corporate circles. The headline was almost neutral. It reported an internal conflict in the tire holding company, where the heiress is challenging her father's decisions. Kai read the article to the end and read it again. The text contained no specifics, no names, no documents, no verifiable facts. There were only references to sources close to the family, unnamed employees, and the tension of recent months. Nothing provable, but plausible enough to attract attention. Kai realized that this was a professional drain, not an exposure, but a tool. The goal was not to reveal the truth, but to create a version of events that will appear before any other. Kai was dialing Shin Ai's number when she texted him. He said he was calling. Shin Ai responded half a year later in a flat voice with a tension beneath the surface characteristic of someone who has already pulled himself together and is working. She said that she had already called her father, and their lawyer Park In-woo was checking the source of the data leaked to the editorial office. Kai asked what was the most urgent thing right now. Shin Ai replied without pause that it was urgent to create a counter-narrative. They had about 6 hours before major publications would start quoting this article. If an official version with specifics and names doesn't appear during this time, the article will become the primary version of events for most who don't know the details. Kai said he was going to see see her. He was there in 20 minutes. There was a coffee machine running in the apartment. Kai had heard it in the hallway. Shin AI was standing at her desk with 2 laptops open and her phone pressed against her ear. She showed him a chair and he sat down. After the call ended, she put down her phone and looked at Kai with a collected, non-panicked expression. Shin AI said that the press secretary is preparing an official rebuttal and her father gave the go-ahead for a public statement, but stressed that a rebuttal is a reaction and a reaction always looks weaker than an initiative. Kai agreed and asked if it was possible to take the initiative first. Shin AI replied that the PR team has a confidential contact with the business editor of a major publication. If you give it an exclusive, it will switch focus and change the agenda. The question was what exactly to give. Kai thought about it and suggested not to reveal the details of the scheme. It was too early and risky. A story should have been presented that Shin AI discovered a discrepancy in operational data and initiated an internal investigation, standard corporate practice. Nothing about OM Chien and CEO, just a competent heir who gets the job done. Shin AI nodded, agreeing that this would remove the conflict narrative and replace it with a managerial one. She dialed her press secretary and spoke clearly and quickly, like someone who understands the value of every minute. After the conversation, Shin AI reported that there was another problem. The article referred to Kai, not by name, but descriptively, as a member of the heiress's entourage who had appeared in recent months. This was enough for the business community that saw them together to draw conclusions. Kai said it was expected. Shin AI looked at him, realizing that this might become a point of pressure on him personally. Kai replied that they should dig, as he had nothing to use against her. Shin AI stared at him for a few seconds, then quietly admitted that she didn't want this to be a problem for Kai. He said that he decides what the problem is for him. She nodded and went back to work on her laptops. They worked for the next 4 hours. Kai coordinated with the press secretary the text of the official statement, checking it from the point of view of a person who does not know the internal history, where there is an excuse instead of a position, where there is a lack of specifics. Shin AI spoke to the lawyers, her father, and the PR team, moving from call to call accurately and without further ado. Around noon, an exclusive was published with a headline that Shin AI initiated an internal audit of the holding, and this is a planned corporate control procedure. After an hour, the first article was no longer quoted in isolation. Each article was now accompanied by an exclusive setting a different context. Shin AI closed one of the laptops and exhaled, noting that everything worked. Kai confirmed it. She got up and went into the kitchen, and when she came back, she leaned against the door frame and looked at Kai. She said that OM Chien thought the same way she did, in terms of pace and logic, which is rare. Kai replied that they were coming from different directions, but in the same direction, and it was working. Shin AI smiled slightly for the first time that morning. Then she seriously added that OM Chien wouldn't stop at one article. It was only the first move, and the second one would be more specific. Kai agreed that the second move is usually faster than the first, and they don't have much time before OM Chien switches to more direct actions, challenging documents, putting pressure on Park Inu, or getting involved with someone in his father's circle. Shin AI said that she needed to meet her father today to find out who in his inner circle might be vulnerable. Kai nodded and added that he needed to warn Park Ina. She had already dialed his number. On Thursday, the second move was not long in coming. Kai woke up at 7 in the morning, his phone already lit up with 2 notifications from news aggregators and one from Shin AI asking him to call immediately. He called, and Shin AI answered the first call. She said that OM Chien applied to the arbitration court with a request to suspend the audit procedure. The formal reason was a technical discrepancy in the dates of the document, the same one that Kai had warned about the day before. Kai got up and started to get dressed, holding the phone to his ear. The petition was filed through a law firm not formally affiliated with OM Chien, which looked technically clean, but in practice was obvious. Kai asked if the memorandum was ready for Park In. Shin AI replied that he was open from 6 in the morning and would be ready by 10. Kai noted that they have 3 hours to file an accompanying package with the court, which will remove the basis for the petition even before the official consideration. If they make it earlier, the order of consideration will change. Shin AI had already called Park In online too. Kai was at her place at 7:30. The apartment looked like headquarters. Both laptops were open, and there were sheets of notes on the table. He took off his coat, picked up one of the sheets, and quickly read the structure of the petition. The technical discrepancy was real, but insignificant, and the memorandum removed it. However, the second point required attention. OM Chi-hyun, through his lawyers, challenged Shin AI's authority to initiate an audit, arguing that under the charter, the right to initiate an audit of this level belongs to the chairman of the board of directors, and not to a strategic development advisor without an official executive position. Kai showed this item to Shin AI and asked her what her official title was. She read it and was silent for a second, then confirmed that it was the Strategic Development Advisor. Kai said they needed a document, a delegation of authority from his father as chairman of the board of directors, explicit, with a date and signature, and preferably today. Shin AI dialed her father. The conversation was brief. She explained the situation. He asked one question, and she answered. My father said he would be at the notary's office at 9, and the document would be ready by 10. Kai checked his watch, 8:15. He sat down next to Shin AI and opened his laptop. The next hour and a half passed in heavy work. Kai checked the cover letter, removed the legal liability where an active position was needed, added specifics where the text was too general. Shin AI coordinated the work of Park In-woo, the notary, her father, and the court. The calls followed one another, each short and precise. At 9:50, the memorandum was ready. At 10:05, a photo of the delegating document arrived.